Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Greg Lawson never imagined his life could collapse on an ordinary September afternoon. He was in the supermarket warehouse, checking inventory for cleaning supplies, when his phone buzzed in his pocket. Colin's name flashed on the screen, and Greg answered absently, expecting maybe an invite to catch the football game over the weekend. But his friend's voice was different, tight, heavy with something Greg couldn't place right away. "Greg, man, I need to talk to you. In person. Can you meet me after work? It's important." There was urgency there, almost embarrassment, that made Greg's stomach clench. Colin wasn't the dramatic type. They'd known each other since high school, over 25 years of solid friendship. If Colin was asking to meet like this, something was wrong. Greg agreed, suggested the supermarket parking lot at 6, and hung up with a strange knot of dread stuck in his throat. The next 3 hours passed in slow motion. Greg tried to focus on inventory spreadsheets, conversations with staff, the daily little crises of managing operations for a supermarket chain in Austin, but his mind kept drifting back to that call. What could Colin possibly have to say that couldn't be handled over the phone? Greg ran through possibilities. Maybe Colin was having financial trouble, maybe he needed help with something personal, maybe it was about the messy divorce he'd gone through last year. But none of that explained the tone of his voice. There was something heavier, something that made Greg's heart beat a little faster every time he remembered the call. When Colin finally pulled his Honda Civic up beside Greg's pickup at 6:15, the September sun was painting the Texas sky in orange hues. Colin stepped out slowly, hands in his pockets, shoulders slumped, and Greg instantly knew his friend was genuinely uncomfortable. They exchanged a nod, and Colin got right to the point. He knew Greg hated beating around the bush. "Man, I didn't want to do this, but, last night at the restaurant, I saw Brenda." Greg frowned, confused. Brenda taught elementary school. She didn't usually go to fancy downtown restaurants. Colin went on, voice low, almost a whisper. "She was with a guy, Greg. It wasn't you. And it didn't look innocent." The words took a few seconds to fully register. Greg felt like the ground had tilted beneath his feet, like reality was rearranging itself into something he didn't recognize. Colin was holding his phone, fingers trembling, and before Greg could ask anything, his friend turned the screen toward him. The photos were too clear, too sharp. Brenda, in a red dress Greg had never seen, hair loose over her shoulders, smiling in that way he knew so well, that private smile she saved for intimate moments. But she wasn't smiling at Greg. She was smiling at a dark-haired man in a navy blue suit, sitting too close to her at a reserved table, their hands nearly touching over the white linen napkin. In the second photo, Brenda's hand rested on his. In the third, they were laughing together, heads tilted toward each other, the kind of closeness that leaves no doubt about the nature of the relationship. Greg's mouth went dry. He blinked, trying to find another explanation, anything that could make sense of this. Maybe it was a coworker, maybe it was a business meeting, maybe, but no. Not this. He knew it deep down, where a sharp, hot pain was beginning to spread. When was this? His voice came out rough, almost unrecognizable. "Last night. Thursday. She said she was grading papers at home, right?" Greg nodded slowly. Brenda had said exactly that. She'd kissed the kids goodnight, told Greg he didn't need to wait up because she'd be late, and walked out with her work bag slung over her shoulder. But apparently, she hadn't gone anywhere near stacks of papers and red pens. Greg swallowed hard, feeling the anger start to boil beneath the shock and disbelief. "Who is he?" Colin shook his head. "I don't know, man. Never seen him before. But, look," I hesitated about whether to tell you or not. "I lay awake all night thinking about it. But if it were me, I'd want to know. You deserve the truth." Greg grabbed his own phone and, without asking, took pictures of the images on Colin's screen. His hands were shaking, but his voice stayed steady when he said, "Thanks, Colin." "Seriously. I know that wasn't easy." Colin placed a hand on his friend's shoulder, squeezed briefly, murmured something about being there if Greg needed him, and got back in his car. Greg stood alone in the empty parking lot as the sky darkened quickly, staring at the photos on his phone like they were evidence of a crime. And in a way, they were. A crime against 12 years of marriage, against the trust he'd placed blindly in Brenda, against the family they'd built together. Greg's first instinct was to call Brenda right away and demand answers. But then something changed inside him, a cold, calculating clarity he didn't know he had. He was impulsive by nature, always preferring to face problems head-on instead of letting them fester, but this was bigger now. He wouldn't give Brenda the chance to spin excuses over the phone, to craft a story, to control the narrative. No. He'd confront her in person, in a way she couldn't escape. Greg got in his pickup and drove home on autopilot, his mind racing. He stopped at Brenda's mother's house, where the kids spent their Thursday afternoons, and picked up Ethan and Sophie as usual. Both jumped into the back seat chattering about school, the drawings they'd made, the dog at Grandma's that had stolen a piece of cake. Greg smiled and answered automatically, but inside he was breaking apart, thinking about how he'd protect these two innocent kids from what was about to happen. At home, Greg gave the kids baths, made a quick dinner of nuggets and fries they loved, and put them to bed earlier than usual, inventing some excuse about an important day tomorrow. Ethan, with his 10-year-old perceptiveness, asked where Mom was, and Greg answered with surprising ease that she was wrapping up some school stuff and would be home later. When he finally closed the kids' bedroom door, Greg went downstairs and took his place in the living room, turning off all the lights except the small corner lamp. He placed Colin's phone on the coffee table right in the center, where Brenda couldn't miss it, and sat on the sofa, hands folded, waiting. Brenda arrived at 9:20, the familiar click of her key in the lock, always a comfort to Greg, now sounding like an intrusion. She walked in with her bag slung over her shoulder, cheeks slightly flushed, hair still too neatly done for someone who'd spent hours grading papers. When she flipped on the living room light and saw Greg sitting there in the dimness, motionless as a statue, she froze, hands still on the switch. "Greg? You scared me. Why's it so dark?" Her voice carried that forced lightness of someone trying to normalize a situation she didn't understand. Greg didn't answer right away. He just pushed the phone across the table toward her, slow and deliberate. "Explain this." Brenda stepped forward slowly, frowning, and picked up the phone. Greg watched every micro-expression on her face as she looked at the photos, the initial confusion, the sudden recognition, the panic rising in her eyes, the pallor spreading across her cheeks. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Greg, I can explain, it's not what it looks like," but her voice was cracking, trembling, because they both knew it was exactly what it looked like. Greg stood up, and even though he wasn't a tall or intimidating man, there was something in his posture at that moment that made Brenda take a step back. "How many times?" The question came out low, almost dangerously calm. Brenda shook her head, tears starting to stream down her face. "Greg, please, let me explain, how many times, Brenda?" His voice rose slightly, edged with sharpness. "How many times did you leave this house, look your kids in the eye, kiss me on the mouth, and go meet this guy?" The confrontation that followed was brutal in its raw honesty. Brenda broke down, collapsing onto her knees on the living room rug, hands over her face, sobbing uncontrollably. Between the tears and ragged breaths, the truth came out in sharp pieces. 4 months. His name was Scott Mercer. A sales rep for educational materials. They'd met at her school during a product presentation. It started with innocent chats, then occasional lunches, then texts, then... Greg listened with a stone-faced expression, jaws clenched, fists clenched on his thighs. When Brenda finished, he waited for the silence to stretch out for long seconds before speaking. "You're going to call him right now?" Brenda looked up, eyes red and swollen. "What?" Call him right now, in front of me, and end this nonsense. Pick up your phone. Brenda tried to protest, said they could talk calmly in the morning, that it wasn't the right time, but Greg wasn't negotiating. Now, Brenda. Or I'll call him and tell his wife everything. That froze her. Wife? Greg grabbed his own phone and showed her the screen. A quick Facebook search had revealed Scott Mercer's profile, married, 3 young kids, multiple photos of a happy family at barbecues and vacations. Did you know he was married? Brenda weakly shook her head, but Greg didn't know whether to believe her. At this point, it didn't matter anymore. With trembling hands, Brenda picked up her phone and dialed. The ringtone echoed in the heavy silence of the room until a male voice, groggy and confused, answered. Brenda? It's almost 10 at night, what's going on? Greg gestured for her to put it on speaker. She obeyed, her voice coming out in a broken whisper. Scott, my husband found out. He knows everything. There was a long pause on the other end, then a string of muffled curses. Greg took the phone from her hand and spoke directly. Scott Mercer? This is Greg Lawson. You have 24 hours to tell your wife about the affair you're having with mine. If you don't, I will. And I'll send all the proof. You decide. Scott tried to stammer out a pathetic defense, something about Brenda telling him she was separated, but Greg hung up mid-sentence. He tossed the phone back to Brenda and announced, with a finality that left no room for argument, the marriage is over. You'll sleep in the guest room tonight. Tomorrow morning, you find a lawyer, because I'm finding mine. And about the boys, we'll see what the judge decides about who's better suited to care for them. The days that followed were a blur of legal consultations, signed documents, and whispered conversations between attorneys. Greg moved with a precision that surprised even himself. He hired Helen Marshall, a family law attorney with a reputation for being ruthless in custody cases, and presented Collins' photos as solid evidence of adultery. In Texas, while no-fault divorce was standard, proof of infidelity could significantly influence decisions about asset division and child custody, especially when arguments were made about moral character and emotional stability of the parents. Helen used this to Greg's advantage with surgical precision. Brenda tried apologizing repeatedly in the first few weeks. She sent long late-night messages begging for a chance to explain, to fix things, saying it had been a terrible mistake, that she loved her family, that she never meant to hurt anyone. Greg read the messages and deleted them without replying. He'd drawn a line in the sand, and there was no going back. The scandal spread through the community inevitably. Secrets in small Texas towns have short legs. Scott's wife, a woman named Jennifer Greg had never met, found out about the affair through an anonymous call Greg made 3 days after confronting Brenda. Jennifer, furious and humiliated, confronted her husband at home, and the argument was so intense neighbors called the police. Scott completely lost control of the narrative. Worse still, Jennifer went straight to Brenda's school, midday, and confronted her publicly in the parking lot, in front of other teachers and parents picking up their kids. The accusations were loud, dramatic, impossible to ignore. One mother filmed part of the scene and posted it to a local Facebook group, and within 48 hours, the entire school community knew the sordid details of the affair between the third-grade teacher and the married sales rep. The school's principal, a conservative woman named Patricia Hines who took the institution's reputation seriously, called Brenda into a private meeting the Monday after the incident. The conversation was brief and painful. Although the school couldn't technically fire Brenda just for having an affair, Patricia made it clear the public exposure, the scandal, and the loss of parental trust made her continued employment unsustainable. She was invited to submit a voluntary resignation letter, with the promise of a neutral reference for future jobs, or face formal disciplinary action that could permanently damage her professional record. Brenda, already emotionally shattered and lacking the energy to fight, signed the resignation letter that same afternoon, leaving the school for the last time with a cardboard box of personal belongings and the crushing weight of shame on her shoulders. Scott didn't fare any better. The educational materials company he worked for, upon learning of the scandal through formal complaints from several district schools that no longer wanted him as a rep, decided to terminate his contract. The official reason was, conduct unbecoming that damages the company's image, but everyone knew the real reason. Scott tried suing for wrongful termination, but his lawyers advised him he had no case, especially considering his behavior had caused documented loss of clients. Within weeks, Scott was unemployed, facing a bitter divorce with Jennifer, and losing regular access to his own children. The divorce process between Greg and Brenda dragged on for 7 months, but the outcome had been predictable from the start. Helen Marshall built a strong case arguing that Brenda had demonstrated poor moral judgment by engaging in an affair that led to public scandal, job loss, and inappropriate exposure of the children to unstable situations. Greg, by contrast, was portrayed as the stable father, steady job, home ownership, no history of questionable behavior. Witnesses included Colin, who described taking the photos, and Jennifer Mercer herself, who gave detailed testimony about the destructive impact of the affair on her family. Brenda tried arguing for equal shared custody, but her lawyer, a tired man named Robert Chen who clearly took the case only for the paycheck, couldn't build a convincing defense against the weight of the evidence. Judge Harold Thompson, a man in his 60s with 3 decades of experience in family court, reviewed all the evidence and testimony before delivering his ruling. In his verdict, he was direct, while acknowledging that a personal lapse in judgment shouldn't automatically disqualify someone as a parent. The specific circumstances of this case, the public exposure of the children to the scandal, Brenda's job loss and resulting financial instability, and Greg's clear ability to provide a stable environment, led to an unequivocal conclusion. Greg was granted primary custody of Ethan and Sophie. Brenda would have supervised visitation initially, progressing to alternating weekends after 3 months, provided she demonstrated stable housing and employment. Additionally, while asset division was relatively equitable, Brenda was ordered to pay child support proportional to her future income, an unusual turn reflecting the fact that Greg was now shouldering the primary responsibility for the children. When the final divorce papers were signed on a cold April afternoon, Greg felt a strange mix of relief and melancholy. He didn't feel victorious, just deep exhaustion and a determination to move forward. Brenda signed the documents with tears streaming down her face, but Greg offered no comfort. They exchanged no words beyond the strictly necessary. When she left the lawyer's office, Greg sat for another 20 minutes, just breathing, processing the fact that 12 years of marriage had been reduced to a stack of legal documents and a signature. 8 months after that terrible September night, Greg was learning to live his new normal. He woke every morning at 6, made breakfast for Ethan and Sophie, took them to school, went to work, picked them up in the afternoon, helped with homework, prepared simple but nutritious dinners, and tucked them in at night with stories and forehead kisses. On the alternating weekends when Brenda had visitation, Greg used the free time to hit the gym, meet up with Colin and other friends, and occasionally have dinner with coworkers. He wasn't ready for dating, and suspected he wouldn't be anytime soon. The wound was still too fresh, the trust too shattered. But he was okay. Not happy, maybe, but functional, present, alive. Ethan and Sophie were adjusting better than Greg expected, though there were difficult nights when Sophie cried for her mom, and mornings when Ethan grew too quiet, lost in thoughts a 10-year-old shouldn't have to process. Greg took them to child therapy, and the psychologist, a gentle woman named Dr. Lisa Ng, helped them name and work through the confusing emotions of their parents' separation. Slowly, routine brought comfort, and the kids began smiling more, fighting over silly things like normal siblings, asking to have friends over to sleep. Greg took that as signs of healing, small victories in a long war against trauma. Brenda, meanwhile, was living a very different reality. She rented a tiny 1-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Austin, far from the neighborhood where she'd built her life. Without her teaching career, she took a job at a telecom customer service call center, earning less than half her previous salary and hating every minute of the repetitive, dehumanizing work. Her parents, who'd always been deeply involved in the grandchildren's lives, stayed in contact but noticeably colder, silent disapproval weighing on every visit. She saw Ethan and Sophie every other week, and those visits were simultaneously the best and worst moments of her life. Best because she could hold her kids and pretend for 48 hours that she was still a present mother, worst because on Sunday nights she had to give them back to Greg and return to her empty apartment, alone with the crushing weight of her choices. Scott Mercer, Greg heard through the inevitable gossip network of a small town, had moved to Dallas after the divorce, trying to start over far from the scandal. He got a job in another sales role, but was paying heavy child support to Jennifer and seeing his kids only once a month. Brenda and Scott tried to keep their relationship going for a few weeks after their divorces, a desperate attempt to justify all the suffering they'd caused by turning the affair into something real, but the relationship collapsed quickly under the weight of guilt, resentment, and the harsh reality that they weren't soulmates in love, they were just two selfish people who destroyed two families for temporary gratification. They stopped speaking 3 months after Greg's divorce was finalized, and Brenda never heard from him again. The last time Greg saw Brenda was on a Saturday afternoon, during a custody exchange at a neutral parking lot they'd agreed on to avoid tension. He arrived with Ethan and Sophie, who ran to hug their mom with the innocent joy of children who still didn't fully grasp the permanence of the separation. Brenda held them tightly, her face buried in their hair, and when she looked up, Greg saw in her eyes a sorrow so deep it almost made him feel sorry. But then he remembered the red dress in the photos, the lies told while looking him in the eye, the nights she kissed him goodnight knowing she'd betrayed the family that same day. The pity evaporated, replaced by a careful indifference he'd cultivated over the months. He nodded, wished her a good weekend, and walked back to his pickup without looking back. Greg drove home through the heavy silence of the Texas afternoon, hands firm on the wheel, eyes fixed on the road ahead. He thought about how life can turn upside down in a single moment, how trust built over years can be shattered in one night, how one person's choices can create waves that drown everyone around them. But he also thought about Ethan asking him to teach him to ride a bike without training wheels, about Sophie drawing a family of 3 instead of 4 but still smiling as she colored, about Colin calling to see if he wanted to play pool on Friday. He thought about all the small good things still in his life, all the reasons to keep waking up every morning and choosing to move forward. When Greg pulled into the garage and walked into the quiet house, he didn't feel loneliness. He felt peace. A peace earned through pain, processed anger, justice sought and won on terms he considered fair. He didn't have Brenda anymore, but he didn't want her. He had his dignity intact, his children under his care, and the absolute certainty that he'd done everything right when faced with the worst betrayal imaginable. He poured himself a glass of iced tea, sat on the living room sofa where it had all begun that September night, and allowed himself a small, bitter smile. Life hadn't given him the happy ending he'd imagined when he married Brenda 12 years ago, but it had given him something perhaps more valuable, the chance to start over with integrity, the opportunity to show his children what it means to have character even when the world falls apart, and the hard but necessary lesson that sometimes the only path forward is to leave behind what can no longer be fixed. Greg Lawson didn't know what the future held, but he knew he'd face it with his head held high, and that was enough. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.